guys, Comic Boom here to do my review of Slugfest, which is a great book written by Reed Tucker. It's called Slugfest-Inside, the epic 50-year battle between Marvel and DC, and in celebration of the book, which I quite enjoyed reading, I wore my Wonder Woman for DC, along with my representing DC, and my Black Panther cap representing Marvel. I am surrounding me is the Fist of Thanos, and of course Darkseid himself. And behind me, I'm surrounded by all things DC and Marvel, and some Valiant and a little bit of everything. But in any event, we're talking about Marvel and DC. We're talking about Slugfest. This is a book written by Reed Tucker. I originally became aware of this book through Captain Cummings. I know he did his review, and I'll post the link below as well. This is a really good book, guys. I took a little bit of extra time because one of the things I actually already did a video on this, and I completely redid it because guess what happened last week? I mean, we all know that Bendis decided to leave Marvel, and this is just so in keeping with the rivalry between Marvel and DC, because that's one of the common themes between Marvel and DC and the rivalry over the last 50 years, and that is people switch from DC to Marvel, creators switch all the time. And not quite as big as the switch, arguably, that Bendis represents going from Marvel to DC, but it just seemed like it cried out for me to redo the video. I also wanted to summarize. I came up with sort of what I view as sort of 10 themes of the book. I think Reed Tucker did a really good job here. Reed Tucker admits at the beginning of the book that he's got a little bit of he admits to a little bit of a Marvel bias. And I think it's appropriate that I'm doing this, I'm doing a review simply because I have a little bit of a DC bias. I love DC and Marvel. I love the rivalry. I think it bodes well for the comic book industry overall. Marvel's come up with a little bit of, well, with Comicsgate, there's some controversy in the last 3 years. Marvel probably has come up under some fire, but frankly, through most of the 50 years, and still even frankly today, Marvel still is ahead in the sales charts, and still ahead in unit sales, just slightly. But that, every now and then, DC over the last 50 years gives Marvel a run for their money. But I just want to cut right to it. I want to talk about the 10 themes that I saw in this great book that I recommend called Slugfest, Inside the 50-Year Battle Between Marvel and DC. And here we go. The first, one of the first themes is the fact that personalities and people matter. Reed Tucker does a really good job explaining the early years of in the 1960s, the early years of DC. DC sort of was like the more conservative. They're sort of like the Eisenhower. Reed Tucker compares DC to Eisenhower, the war hero, conservative war hero coming out of World War II. And Marvel, which really took off in the 1960s, 1961, I believe it was August of 1961, Stan Lee wrote Fantastic Four, and people could relate to it. Marvel was considered almost like JFK, a little bit more cooler and hip. And they really took off in the 1960s, and in approximately 10 years, Marvel overtook DC in the comic book sales. Reed Tucker does a great job explaining the personalities, in particular Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, who always got a kick out of the fact that the executives at DC couldn't figure out what Marvel was doing. Carmen Infantino, the publisher for DC at the time, could never really figure things out in terms of what Marvel was doing so much better. And Carmen Infantino also, he sort of looked, he thought of his creators and writers almost like children, and you don't listen to what children tell you. And plus, Carmen Infantino never bothered to read the competition. He never bothered to read Marvel comics to really know exactly what made them appeal to so many people. And it's these types of personalities that really people matter. And one of the themes that comes through Slugfest is, you know, it does matter who runs the business. The attitudes of the people that run the business ultimately define and end up leading to what the quality of the publications that are being put out. So the types of comic books that are being printed, it does matter what a business attitude is. And the one thing that has remained prevalent even to this day is the conservative nature of DC and Marvel's attitude, that, which originated with Stan Lee, that they're just cooler and hipper. And that really comes through in shining colors. The other thing is that shines through in the book is comic books are political. They are absolutely political. They will always be political in nature. But it's the balance of not ramming that politics down your throat. But politics are there, and there's no more evidence of that than in present-day Comicsgate. I find it very interesting that one of the things that Reed Tucker illustrates very clearly is just how DC's conservative nature really hurt them in the 60s and 70s. It's why they lost so much market share and ultimately ended up losing to Marvel. Because remember, I believe it was August of 1971 where Marvel pulled ahead of DC in sales and has never really looked back, aside from the odd months here and there. Marvel's always stayed ahead, and that's because DC has been so conservative in its approach to comics, generally speaking, that it's really held them back in terms of really pushing the envelope a little bit. When DC finally did that, it's always when DCs went outside their conservative comfort zone where they really come up with their great classic stories, whether it's Watchmen or The Dark Knight Returns, or even when they tried to make sense of their continuity with the Crisis on Infinite Earths, leading to the big events. It's when DC tried to go out of their comfort zone, and in many ways, if you have a Marvel bias, you could argue that DC was trying to Marvelize itself whenever it tried to do that. Of course, DC always takes the attitude that they're a little bit more uppity, that their stuff is more literature, whereas Marvel comics are more pandering to the masses, so to speak. So, in any event, what's interesting is that the conservative nature of DC really hurt them in the 60s and 70s. And yet here we have, with Rebirth, the conservative nature of DC has actually helped DC because it's gone back to the conservative nature, back to Rebirth, back to the way things were, focusing more on their classic. And what's Marvel doing? Marvel is doubling down on believing itself to be cooler and hipper, and rather than really embracing their classic characters, Marvel right now, I argue, is really trying to continue to be the voice on the street, a reflection of the street, like Stan Lee always bragged that Marvel was, that they had the pulse on the beat of the street, and that they're cooler and hipper and they know where it's at. And because of that, Marvel is indeed doing what it's always done in the 60s and 70s, but unfortunately what's in the street right now is identity politics. So while Marvel might still be, we could argue that Marvel is still maybe more of a reflection of the people on the street, the fact is the people on the street are riddled with identity politics and victimhood. And right now the social and political chaos in the United States, and particularly New York City, of which Marvel has always been more of a voice of New York City, it's all identity politics, and that causes a lot of controversy, and that's caused the Comicsgate controversy, as that most of us are aware of. So it's very interesting that I would argue that the current Comicsgate controversy, it's not because Marvel has necessarily abandoned the voice of Stan Lee or the voice of Kirby, but arguably the problem that Marvel has is precisely because they've embraced it and gone too far with it, because they're reflecting the voice on the street, and the voice on the street is simply chaotic and riddled with identity politics that no one likes. So it's interesting in that respect. It made me reevaluate maybe the foundations of Comicsgate and what Marvel actually stands for vis-a-vis DC. The theme of Slugfest that Reed Tucker does a good job showing is that comic book controversy, they really are cyclical in nature, and I think I just sort of touched upon that by stating that, you know, DC's conservative approach may have hurt it in the past, but it really seems to have helped it now. And for Marvel, it's rebellious, sort of more liberal, open-minded attitude to Marvel's propensity to write about the flaws of characters made it extremely successful in the 60s and 70s. But Marvel nowadays with Comicsgate, they've sort of evolved flaws, and instead of writing about the characters' flaws, they're really writing about the characters' victimhood and the characters' identity politics. And Marvel has made the mistake presently of confusing flaws with politics, and that's what's causing their current I think sales woes, as they slowly are losing more and more in sales. The fourth theme in Slugfest, again, which I've touched upon, the 1960s distinction between DC and Marvel is still prevalent. In the 1960s, I mean, DC's heroes and icons, Superman, Wonder Woman, they're mythological in nature, and whereas Marvel characters are more they're the street characters. They're the view from the street, and you really see this illustrated most profoundly in the JLA versus Avengers crossover event that was written by Kurt Busiek and drawn beautifully by George Perez, and that that crossover took a long time coming, but that crossover took place in 2003, 2004. But it had its origins before then. The crossover events between DC and Marvel are huge. The first one was in 1976 with Superman and Amazing Spider-Man. There was one in 1981, Batman and the Hulk. In 1996 was the famous Amalgam series, which crossed over numerous heroes, where numerous DC and Marvel heroes fought each other. And then, of course, the momentous JLA Avengers. And unfortunately, due to the nature of Slugfest and the rivalry between Marvel and DC, we'll probably never see those types of crossovers again. But it's what's epic about it is that you really see just how you really see the rivalry between the two when you look at the way those crossover events were done. If you look at the cover of Superman v Spider-Man, you could see that Superman and Spider-Man had to be proportionately the same size on the cover page, and they argued about top billing, and they had to argue about how they fought each other and who would win, and one couldn't look any better than the other one in the pages of the story. All that changed ultimately with JLA v Avengers, where they focused on the different mythologies of the DC and Marvel universe, where in the DC universe, as we all know, superheroes are revered. Superman, Wonder Woman, the Justice League are revered as sort of gods and heroes, where in the Marvel universe, heroes are generally looked down upon, and you have the mutant hysteria, and they focus on the discrimination element, which was very common in the 60s, and Marvel continues to ride that wave. So while the heroes are generally looked down upon and usually have more struggles in the Marvel universe, you also see in the present day Marvel universe, you have them doubling down on victimhood. Now, not only are their heroes, do their heroes have flaws, but their heroes are now also victims. That whether it's because they're gay or transgender or some other thing, or because of the color of their skin, now it's victimhood, it's identity politics, and whatever stance you take on that, it's very interesting that Marvel is doubling down on that moving forward. And their legacy is not like Rebirth at all. Their legacy is continuing to focus on identity politics, whereas DC's Rebirth is focusing on the conservative elements of going back to what makes their characters intriguing and appealing to so many DC fans. Now, as you can see, I do have a little bit of a DC bias, because DC presently is doing it right. If I'd have done this review, if this book existed 5 years ago, I hated the New 52, and I think the DC blew it with the New 52, but they saw the error in their ways. They essentially apologized to fans, more or less, and they went back to the conservative roots, which is what Rebirth is, and it's worked tremendously. Marvel, not so much. But you guys might disagree with me on that, and you can comment below if you like. Another thing that Reed Tucker talks about, points 6 and 7, which I've already talked about, Marvel's strength in the 60s is its weakness today. Marvel's strengths in writing its characters that worked so well in the 60s has come back to haunt it, I think, today, as I've already mentioned. And DC, and vice versa for DC. That's point number 7. 8, big events, gimmicks, variant covers, and company crossovers. These all sell extremely well. They continue to sell. The first variant cover was Man of Steel in 1986, coming out of the crisis. And it's really, the comic book industry has never looked back. The gimmicks and the variant covers went crazy, of course, in the 90s, leading, of course, to the downfall and the great boom and bust of the 1990s. All of comic books imploded in the early 90s. You see the same pattern sort of coming back presently, where more and more variant covers. We're seeing a lot of variant covers for Marvel events, for DC events, and it's part of their selling patterns. They want to, Marvel, for example, if you can't sell more comic books to more people, the idea is to sell 2 comics or sell the same comic with a different cover to the same customer, so you accomplish the same thing. You don't need to double your client base or customer base if you can sell the same product twice to the same existing customer base. And that's really what's happening, and that's one of the dangers of the existing comic book market. The fear is that we comic collectors are a dying breed, is that we're slowly dying off, and there's about 100,000 of us that are slowly dying off, and eventually will comic books die with us? We hope not, but we are increasingly a niche market, despite the fact that we've got mega movies that are selling billions of dollars and making lots of money. It doesn't seem to be reflected, there doesn't seem to be a comic book sales growth that is commensurate with the success of comic book superhero movies. Another theme that is prevalent is the fact that talent defections are not uncommon. And wow, who would have thought we'd have seen a defection that was arguably more significant than when Jack Kirby left Marvel in 1971 to go to DC? Who would have thought we would have ever have seen a more significant defection from one comic book company to another than when Jack Kirby left Marvel in 1961 to go to DC before going back to Marvel again in 1976. Huge stuff. But lately, but the latest news with Brian Michael Bendis, after 17 years with Marvel, Brian Bendis going to DC. This is huge news, and it's not something that you see very often. And it's really a reflection of sort of the of what's gone on in the past. Many times, people would sort of get their roots, or they get their experience early on with DC in the 60s, and then they would move on to arguably bigger and better things at Marvel, and vice versa. And what Reed Tucker does in Slugfest is that he tells those stories, and that's my favorite thing about Slugfest, is that you get into the human interest stories, because it's about the people, and hearing the voices, and hearing all the interviews and the stories of people that have gone through this. Reed Tucker, he read all the back issues of comics journals going back to the, I understand, the 60s and 70s. Reed Tucker did an interview with Ryan Higgins for Comic Conspiracy, and it's clear that he did a lot of research here, did a lot of reading. And it's really great to hear the voices, to hear what Carmen Infantino was like, to hear voices like Ron Mars, Todd McFarlane, Stan Lee, and in particular when you hear about some of the rivalries and some of the things that were said between DC and Marvel. In particular, probably the most scathing attack when they would badmouth each other came in on April 29th, 2002. I put this quote up when Joe Quesada, for those just a reminder, a little bit of background. The comic book publishing, it probably reached its peak in the 90s in April of 1993, and Reed Tucker does a really good job of explaining why it reached its peak. It reached its peak because of all the speculators got into it. So, I mean, literally for as little as $300, Tucker writes, you could get an account with with any distributor, and you could be receiving comic books. There were comic book shops. There was as many as 8,000 comic book shops across North America that every Wednesday some people would literally just open up once or twice a week. They would literally just rent a storage unit and open up only once a week to sell comic books, because everyone was getting in on the speculator craze. So that type of boom was bound to bust, and boy did it ever bust spectacularly, as we all know. April 1993 represented the height of the comic book boom, but by the year 2000, there was a 75% drop in the number of comic book shops. Because people realized that, look, when you sell 3 million or 4 million copies of X-Men #1, they will never, ever, ever grow in value. To this day, you can find X-Men #1 in 25-cent bins and dollar bins. They are a dime a dozen. Why? Because there's so damn many of them out there. People abandoned common sense in the 90s, and of course, when common sense hits you, it usually hits pretty hard, and you call it a bust. And that's exactly what happened. And as the comic book industry, as the boom was slowly becoming a bust, Marvel was riding high, and Marvel Marvel and DC were still, of course, competing, but Marvel was the place to go. And DC, in trying to compete with Marvel, they were looking into buying a company called Malibu Comics. Well, DC was Marvel at that time was owned by Ron Perlman, who loved corporate takeovers, so he got in on the negotiations, and he ended up buying Malibu instead. And he did one thing further than that. He not only bought Malibu, which was a disastrous purchase because Marvel did nothing with the Malibu characters, but he also bought Heroes World Distribution. So Marvel, for the first time, was going to distribute its own comic books. Now he did that in 1994. And having bought Heroes World Distribution, it was a disaster because Heroes World Distribution was simply not big enough to distribute all of Marvel's comic books. And before that time, there was lots of distributors, so Marvel and DC it was easy to negotiate better distribution deals because it was more competitive. Well, as a result of Marvel doing their own distribution, which ended up being a disaster, that gave DC a lot of bargaining power with the remaining distributors who all went toward DC because they all wanted DC's business. So DC ended up signing an exclusive deal with a company called Diamond Distributions, or now known as Diamond Book Distributors. And of course, in 3 short years, from 94 to 97, in 97, Marvel's Heroes World collapsed. And and Ron Perlman declared bankruptcy, and Marvel was at very much a low point. That's around the same time where they began to market out and license out some of their properties, Spider-Man to Sony and X-Men to 20th Century Fox, and a lot of these deals that are looked back upon with great dismay now. But at the time, they were actually good deals because it gave Marvel some much-needed cash flow. But in any event, that's how we ended up with a monopoly with comic books distribution, is because of Marvel's disastrous attempt to do their own distribution. It ended up, when Marvel came back, crawling on their hands and knees to Diamond. Diamond already had an exclusive deal with DC, and so Marvel signs a deal with Diamond, and to this day we still have Marvel and DC distributing solely through Diamond Distributions, and there's all kinds of complaints to this day. It's been virtually universal agreement that it's a disastrous arrangement, that Diamond has really there's nothing really good to say about Diamond Distributors. Nobody has anything good to say about them. It's a monopoly in every sense of the term. It's a monopoly. I'll be honest with you, I don't know how it's even legal. I think it's because once in a blue moon somebody else does some distributions, but really it's a disaster, and it's truly unfortunate, and all because of the rivalry. So the rivalry between DC and Marvel, as much as it's led to some great creative output in terms of some great comic books in their competition, it's also led to some disastrous business decisions. It led to Marvel's bankruptcy. It's led to a horrible distribution network that we still have to put up with to this day. It's created many problems. Now, having said that, one of the things that the rivalry did is that it did create the direct sale market. It helped to create the direct sale market in the late 1970s, early 1980s, which allowed DC and Marvel to keep better track of all their comic books, and rather than having so many returned, because it used to be if you sold comic books, whichever comic books you didn't sell, you could rip the covers off of them and send back the unsold copies and get refunded. So that was great for people who sold comic books, whether it was in convenience stores or wherever, because there wasn't a lot of exclusive only comic shops that only sold comic books. Well, with the exclusive retail market, the direct sale market, all the comic books were non-returnable. So early on, the direct sale market, it became very clear that was the future of comic books, which of course that's exactly what it became, because Marvel and DC could sell all the comic books they want to the retailers and nothing would be returned, so they could make a lot more money, and make a lot more money is exactly what they did. And of course that's led to what we have today. And the personalities involved in this, and other stories, like the end of the Comics Code Authority under Bill Jemas. Bill Jemas hired Joe Quesada, and this probably represents the ultimate low point in relations between DC and Marvel. Bill Jemas really knew nothing about comic books. He didn't have a comic book background, and he fired Bob Harras, and he hired Joe Quesada. They created the Marvel Knights imprint. They put Marvel back on the map. 2001 was the first year after essentially 7 years of continuous downward sales trends. 2001 represented the first time that there was actually an increase in comic book sales, and Joe Quesada at Marvel he was largely responsible for that. Him and Jimmy Palmiotti did a fairly good job back in 2000, sort of getting comic books a little back on their feet again. And but he also attacked DC. Got the quote there of how he really put down DC, as he states, "What the F is DC anyway?" Mr. Quesada said, stoking the fires. They'd be better off calling it AOL Comics. At least people know what ALL is. I mean, they have Batman and Superman and they don't know what to do with them. That's like being a porn star with the biggest dick and you can't get it up. What the F? Paul Levitz, DC's president and publisher, declined to comment for the story through a spokesperson. As a matter of fact, the end story to that Reed Tucker writes, is actually very interesting. It was at the Chicago Comic-Con. So 2 years later at the Chicago Comic-Con in 2004, Brian Bendis, of all people, this is very interesting in light of his recent defection, Brian Bendis was talking about wanting to do a Daredevil Batman crossover. And in answer to a fan's question, Bendis basically indicated that the reason why it wasn't going to happen was because Paul Levitz wouldn't let it happen. And lo and behold, Bob Wayne, who worked for DC at the time, he was involved in publishing and marketing. He spoke up. He actually spoke up and told Brian Bendis that no, that's not true. And they got into a little bit of an argument. And he said that DC would be happy to do a Daredevil Batman crossover. Marvel only had to do one thing, and that was to get rid of Joe Quesada, because at that time they had already fired Bill Jemas. They had already gotten rid of Bill Jemas, and they just needed to get rid of one more person, and that was Joe Quesada, after which time they would happily do a Daredevil Batman crossover. And in response to that, at the end, Brian Bendis made the comment, well, I guess I'll never work at DC. And guess what? Here we are, 13 years later, and Bendis is working for DC. So it's good for DC that they probably have forgotten about that little altercation that took place in the 2004 Chicago Comic-Con. But these are the types of stories in Slugfest that are just wonderful to read. And Reed Tucker's done a really good job. And I encourage everyone to get this. This is easy reading. You don't have to be a lover of history you don't need to be into history to enjoy this. These stories are these are human interest stories. These are stories that will make you laugh, make you shake your head at the craziness of how things were over the decades, all over something as significant as a comic book, of all things. A further example of how personalities matter in running a comic book company is the difference between somebody like Paul Levitz, I guess, I'm not sure how to say his last name, Paul Levitz. When he ran DC, he was very conservative, and he was always someone who took the high road. Despite comments made by Joe Quesada in April of 2002, when he basically compared DC to a limp dick porn star, there was multiple examples of Mr. Levitz taking the higher road and refusing to engage in bad-mouthing Marvel. One time in particular that Reed Tucker indicates was in 1999 for the Alan Moore series League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in issue 5. Alan Moore, who did not have a great love for Marvel, actually had in one of the panels, he had a vaginal hygiene product that he called Marvel. And so the vaginal hygiene product was actually called Marvel, and it was Alan Moore's way of calling Marvel Comics a douche. And while Paul Levitz would have none of that, and they actually recalled publication. They spent thousands of dollars to halt publication, to bring it back, and to change the name of that feminine hygiene product from Marvel to Amaze, just because Paul Levitz did not want to push the buttons and to offend Marvel. And that was in 1999. And then when you just think less than 3 years later, you got Joe Quesada, because in 2000, that's when Bill Jemas comes in. So Bill Jemas comes in a year after Paul Levitz does something like that, because he didn't want to badmouth Marvel. And then Jemas comes in a year later, hires Joe Quesada. Then 2 years later, Quesada makes those comments to the Observer magazine about DC being a limp dick porn star, essentially. Wow. It's really a difference between classy and not classy, between being an a-hole versus a nice guy. And you gotta wonder, there was lots of people, by the way, that wanted to say something. A lot of people for DC that wanted to defend DC, but Paul Levitz wouldn't let them. One thing that's made clear is that Mr. Levitz accomplished quite a bit. Mr. Levitz is really responsible for the trade paperback market. It was Paul Levitz whose decision to create a trade paperback of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns that really created that format, and it's one of the things that he's most proud of. So there's something to be said about being the nice guy, being staunchly very conservative, You can also be extremely brilliant, and Levitz is an example of that. One other thing I wanted to bring up, Reed Tucker he gives numerous examples of how frustrated DC was in the 1960s, trying to figure out what Stan Lee was doing, why people were so fascinated, and why they kept buying Marvel comic books so much. Because one thing in the 60s is that Marvel was selling less comic books than DC was in the 60s, in the 1960s, but they had a higher sell-through. So even though Marvel was selling less numbers of comic books, they were getting less returns. So their sell-through rate was about 70% compared to DC's 50%, and that's very significant. Because today, for example, it's sort of flip-flop, because today, because of Comicsgate and the problems Marvel's having, DC has a better sell-through rate. If you look at all the pictures online of all those Marvel comic books still on the stands, retailers are selling through higher amounts of DC comics than they are Marvel right now, and so it's sort of flip-flop a little bit. And of course, the problem that retailers have is that they can't return their comic books like retailers or comic book sellers could in the 1960s and 70s. In any event, it's interesting. I've shown a picture here of an issue of Fantastic Four, issue 15, and Wonder Woman, both 12-cent comic books. I'm showing this because at one point DC tried copying the word count on the covers, because Reed Tucker explains that in trying to figure out what Marvel is doing different, it never occurred to anyone at DC, and certainly not Carmen Infantino, who was the publisher at the time, that Marvel was writing about characters that people were actually interested in. Peter Parker talking to his Aunt May for 2 pages. They go, why would they be interested in that? They figured Marvel had terrible art. They didn't like Jack Kirby's art. They thought Jack Kirby's art was blockier, it wasn't as good as theirs, it wasn't as clean and as sharp as Kurt Swan's drawings of say Superman. They couldn't understand what this appeal of Marvel Comics was, and so they did such crazy things as even copying the word count. And I found it very funny, and I thought I'd just put side by side. So imagine you're an executive in the offices of DC Comics in downtown New York, and it's 1965, and you're looking at an issue of Fantastic Four, and you figure, well, maybe it's the word count, so let's have more words on our cover. And so you come out with the next issue of Wonder Woman having 84 words on the cover page. I mean, good Lord. Obviously, Fantastic Four kicked Wonder Woman's butt in sales at that time, I believe, but it's an example of what worked and what didn't work. They even went through other theories where maybe they experimented with different colors on their cover, hoping to duplicate Marvel's success, or they try to imitate different characters on the cover, the size of the character. They went through all kinds of different variations to try to duplicate Marvel's success, having it never occur to them why that it was Stan Lee's storytelling that did it. Reed Tucker tells a great story of Jim Shooter making a comment about how Jim Shooter, when he worked for DC before going over to Marvel, he joked that nobody at DC could understand why there was a cover of X-Men that had Angel on it, and everyone seemed to be fascinated with the fact that Angel could fly. Well, and all the DC executives could think of as, well, Superman flies all the time, what's the big deal? They couldn't understand that it was the fascination with flying that the young had that was selling X-Men comic books, and it was the relatability of the characters. And Jim Shooter saw this, and he expressed some sort of sarcastic frustration with the fact that, DC just never saw it at the time. And in any event, the personalities and the stubbornness and the refusal to admit that maybe the competition, you can learn from the competition. That's one of the things that really shines through with Slugfest, is the stubbornness, and how stubbornness can ruin your company. It can affect sales because you're not willing to look at what works with the other side. Competition can be healthy, but you can't ignore the competition. And you really see that happening now in so many ways. Marvel and DC, they're best when they learn from each other, when they learn from the mistakes of each other. And you really got to wonder now, is Marvel learned anything from the success of Rebirth? They don't appear to have learned anything. Have they learned anything about the failure of how they've been publishing their comic books over the last 3 years? I would argue not. They don't really seem to be learning anything. They're stubborn about it. Marvel's so stubborn about it. Marvel right now is so stubborn in insisting that the reason why the comic books aren't selling is because everyone is arguably racist, because we're not buying comic books that have a different color, skin-colored person on their cover or some damn nonsense. That it doesn't occur to them that their stories are just shitty. They got shitty storytelling, and the comic books just aren't particularly good right now, and that's why they're going down in sales. They still have good sales, Marvel. They still have more units sold than DC, despite all that. It's because they've been so much higher in sales in DC for so long. And the Marvel zombie fan base is so stubborn that they'll stick with Marvel no matter what, even to buy their comic books to criticize them on YouTube. But the fact of the matter is that Marvel just insists that they know that they know better than their own readership. And it's that arrogance that Marvel currently has with Comicsgate, insisting that there's something wrong with the personalities of us comic book readers, especially if we're white and male, right? There's something wrong with us, that we're the ones with the flaws, that we're the ones that are screwed up, and that they're doubling down. Marvel's not changing. DC, what does DC do? DC wisely says, we're going to go back to selling comic books to our fan base. And we're going to sell to our fan base, and we're going to go back to focusing on our characters that everyone knows and loves. And we're not going to make identity politics. We're not going to make issues where there doesn't need to be any. We're just going to tell good stories. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. But the stubbornness of DC in the 1960s is now the stubbornness of Marvel in the 2010s, because it doesn't bode well. You gotta stick with what works, guys. And Marvel, I think, is learning the hard way right now, and they need to relearn the lessons of the past that DC learned through the failure of the 60s, 70s, and in particular the failure of the New 52. But that's what I love about Slugfest, is that it puts historical perspective. That these controversies that we think are so new, Comicsgate, it's just a rehash of the same controversies that have existed in the past, but in a slightly different nuances. This is a great book. Reed Tucker has done a good job. There's more I can say, but guys, I'm just going to tell you to pick up this book. It's worth reading. Whether you're a comic book fan or not, this is a story about how personalities can affect business, and how stubbornness and refusal to read one's competition. There's a lot of business lessons here. This is well worth the read, and especially if you're a comic book fan. So guys, from Thanos and Darkseid, and from Comic Boom, we're out.